Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you for taking time on this wonderful Tuesday evening to join us. I am Lauren Wells. I'm the president of the Newark Public Library. And as a support to me and as a support to really beginning to bring new audiences to the library, we formed the Newark Public Library President's Coterie. And Linda Baraka and Jaron Kenny are the chairs of this group. And the book club is actually Linda's baby. She really wanted to do a book club with the library, so we just took it on as one of our projects. And I have to say that when I joined the library board almost 2 years ago, one of the conversations that was happening was that there was this librarian in the library who's the teen librarian, really amazing person, has got this book contract with Simon & Schuster, right? And so it was just like, oh, well, that's pretty awesome. You know, people don't talk about the really wonderful things that happen within our library and the wonderful people that exist within our library. And we often don't really get to see the librarians push out into the community in this way. So we're really excited to have Maisy with us tonight to talk about these ghosts are family. I know I've got some ghosts that are family, and I'm sure everyone
don't we all
has some ghosts that are family. They hang around. Sometimes they knock things over in my kitchen. But with all of that being said, we are looking forward to a really exciting conversation and discussion with Maisy and with all of you. And I'm going to pass it over to Maisy.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for listening. I guess since maybe not everyone has read the book, I just wanted to start with giving like a short summary of the book. So These Ghosts Are Family, I think I'm going to adjust my screen so I can see myself, it's about a Jamaican family called the Paisleys. And it begins with the patriarch of the family, Abel Paisley, who's an old man, deciding to confess this secret. And a secret is basically that when he was a younger man in 1970, he decided to fake his own death while he was working in England in order to abandon his family in Jamaica and get away from his responsibilities. And then he ends up remarrying another woman, going to America and starting a new family. And, you know, the novel starts in the present day Harlem with, you know, each side of the family not knowing about each other. And he's about to kind of reveal this big family secret. And the structure of the book is a little non-conventional. It's a novel in stories, so each chapter can be read as a standalone story, but it can also be read, you know, as a larger narrative. You know, and it jumps back and forth in time, and it focuses on a different person who's either a descendant of Abel Paisley or an ancestor. So I wanted to just start by reading a short excerpt. So I think I'll read maybe like the first part of chapter 1, and then I'll go and read like a brief, a couple paragraphs in the past, because there is a part of the section that jumps to Jamaica in the 1800s. So the overall theme is kind of two themes, like the effects of secrets on a family, but also the effect of kind of colonialism and our history, Western history of racism on the Jamaican family. So I'm going to start by reading the first chapter, which is called The True Death of Abel Paisley. And it starts in Harlem in 2005. Let's say that you are a 69-year-old Jamaican man called Stanford, or Stan for short, who once faked your own death. Though you have never used those words to describe what you did, at the time you thought of it as seizing an opportunity placed before you by God. But since your wife, Adele, died a month ago, you've convinced yourself her heart attack was retribution for your sin. So today you have gathered 3 of your female descendants in one house, even the daughter who has thought you dead all these years, and decided that you will finally tell them the truth. You are not who you say you are. You've spent the last 20 years of your second life living in a brownstone in Harlem, running a West Indian grocery store. Recently, you shuttered the store. You have given up on fighting your arthritis pain and are finally sitting in the wheelchair Adele picked out. You are looking out of your parlor window, waiting for your daughter, the one who thinks you are dead, to arrive. It's been 35 years since you've seen her, so you study each woman who passes your house for reflections of yourself. You haven't bothered to shave, press your clothes, or comb your hair. You are ready to be still and rot. You imagine the death of Stanford Solomon, unlike the abrupt end of Abel Paisley, will be achingly slow. Already it feels like you are losing small pieces of yourself daily. To you, old age is the torture you deserve, a slow, insignificant death, your matter dispersing into the air like that dandelion seeds until the day there's nothing left. When you died the first time, you were still a young man in your 30s and had been working in England for less than a year. It wasn't easy for an immigrant, especially a Black man, to find a decent job back then. But through a boy you'd known back in primary school, Stanford, you'd gotten a room and a job on a ship. You had no idea it was just the beginning of your streak of good luck. You and Stanford were the chosen wogs they allowed to work alongside the white men. Stanford complained often about London. He hated the cold. He missed his grandmother and the tiny village, Harrowtown, where you'd both grown up back in Jamaica. You'd already escaped the countryside for Kingston, and from there, London. You felt free. That sense of freedom and joy only dampened when you thought of the family you left behind. Your first wife, Vera, wrote you long letters weekly about how you'd abandoned her and left her to become a dried up old spinster. But you both know perfectly well that it was her idea for you to go to England, where she thought you'd somehow become a better provider. Your son, Vincent, was still in Vera's womb when you sailed off. Your daughter, Irene, a stumbling toddler. You had barely settled in when Vera's first letter arrived, with the list of things she wanted you to buy and send to them. With every letter, the list grew longer, and you worried that you would never be enough. The day you died, you were running along the dock because you were late for work while a container was being lowered onto the ship. You stopped short when the container fell, dropped from the crane, and thundered against the deck. You were close enough to hear the screaming. Who was it? You heard someone shout. One of the wogs, another answered. It's Abel. For a moment you were confused, hearing yourself pronounced dead. It was like one of those movies where the dead person's spirit hangs by watching as a crowd gathers around his body. But no, you were certain it wasn't your body, so you boarded the ship. The captain approached you immediately and said, I'm sorry, mate, no way Abel could have survived that. You almost laugh now when you think of it. The one-time racism worked in your favor. The captain had gotten his wogs confused, looked you right in the eye, and mistaken you for the other Black guy. Abel was dead, crushed under the container, unrecognizable. But you, Stanford now, could turn and go home. Perhaps it's telling about your nature that you did not hesitate. You nodded and turned away and walked away quickly from Abel and all his responsibilities before any of the others had a chance to recognize you. Back in the room at the boarding house, you rifled through your roommate's things and learned what it really meant to be Stanford. You and Stanford actually did look alike, which made it a little easier to forgive the fact that all the white people had trouble telling you apart. You were the same height, the same light brown complexion, the same lanky build. You, Abel, did not arrive dressed for an English winter, so you had even taken to wearing Stanford's clothes. Of course, you thought of your family, your wife Vera. You thought about the 2 life insurance policies you'd purchased, the one she'd made you take out before you left, and the one the company made mandatory. You decided you were worth more to her dead. Vera was beautiful. She would find a new husband, a richer one. The children were young enough to embrace a new father, and they would finally live the life Vera thought she deserved, the one she had no qualms about constantly demanding of you. Stanford had little family, no wife, no children. That was what clinched things for you. Stanford was raised by his grandmother, who was in her 70s and losing her eyesight. You could continue writing her letters, sending her a little money, and there was no bother there. What surprised you was how right it felt, at least then. When you met Adele shortly after you became Stanford, you connected with her immediately. Like you, she was Jamaican and had left her family to work in England. Though at 19, she was almost 15 years younger than you. You were as drawn to her as you had been to your first wife, and she to you. The difference was Adele did not try to remake and mold you. When you told her the truth, the very first night you spent together, that you had taken your friend's name, she did not try to dissuade you. Instead, she avoided the subject until you proposed, and she said yes on the condition that you live in America, as if leaving that country could leave the lie behind. Later, the guilt would hit her first. A few years after coming to the US, she had started to go to church multiple times a week and suggested that you atone. You remember having laughed at the thought that getting down on your knees could redeem you. But since the day that she collapsed in the store, you've been thinking about your past. You've been thinking about that word fake, and you decided you were right to never use it to describe what you've done. You are a thief, pure and simple. It wasn't Stanford's life you had stolen, for he would have lost that regardless. It was his death. Where is his soul now, circling the world, looking for a grave that does not yet exist? Isn't it about time you gave him his due? Your granddaughter has taught you to use the computer to kill some of your idle time. It was easier than you thought to find your first daughter, to track her journey from Jamaica to New York. You are thinking about the grave that bears your real name and all of the people who needlessly mourned you when Irene finally arrives, the daughter who thinks you are dead. She is under the impression that she has been called to your house to care for an old man in a wheelchair. That old man is you. You didn't realize just how little you've thought about her all these years until you watch her climb the stoop, and all of the feelings that you should have had for your firstborn suddenly rushes through you. When she enters, you see her mother, Vera's wide, obstinate mouth, her large, slightly bulbous hazel eyes, her flaring nostrils. You can sense immediately, before she even speaks, that she also has her mother's brutal tongue. You are intimidated. She has a look that says she is afraid rope, one tug away from snapping, and it occurs to you to wonder if, when you tell her the truth, she will kill you. In that moment, your death, your real death, flashes in your mind. You have never had a premonition before, but now the certainty of it causes you to slump forward in your wheelchair. You have a vision of a woman supporting your weight as you make your way up this flight of stairs, bringing you all the way to the top and then just letting you go, as if she just remembered she was supposed to be somewhere else. Your daughter, who moments before had introduced herself as Irene, the name you gave her, bends down and asks, "You are right, Mr. Solomon." You sit up straight, or as straight as an old man with scoliosis and arthritis can, and say, "You can call me Stanford." So that was one of the passages set, in more recent times. And so part of the way the novel is structured is that, it kind of just dips back and forth. So we get kind of slices of this family and the different members across time. So there is a passage that is set, and one of the things when I wrote this section, it's set in the 18th century, just before the end of slavery in Jamaica. It's during an event that was called the Christmas Rebellion, which was this huge slave rebellion that started it was supposed to be a coordinated labor strike where all the slaves stopped working, but it ended up getting progressively more violent. And eventually, all the white men on the island formed militias to kind of tamp down. And I think they executed maybe like 300 to 400 slaves after, but, it was so extreme that after that, England or the Queen or whatever, they decided to create what was called the apprenticeship program. So after the Christmas Rebellion, the following 8 years, all slaves would become apprentices, and eventually after that period, that slavery was ended. So this is set in actually 1832, like right after the Christmas Rebellion. And this is kind of focused on the theme of kind of passing. The character is supposed to be an ancestor who's a white girl who suddenly, who thinks she's a white girl and suddenly realizes that her mother was actually a slave. And so I think I'll only read, like the last 3 paragraphs of this. Mr. Fowler made a speech at dinner. I could not hear it, for as I watched him, I only grew angrier. It felt as if that anger muted my other senses. I thought about what he had done to my mother, and it made me almost want to remain there just to see him lit on fire. It was vile, after all. Mr. Fowler had watched as hundreds of Negro and colored men and women, my own mother, were hanged and let the John Crows pick at their flesh, yet he would no doubt tire of this place and follow behind Peter Gay one day. He would live the life of an English gentleman and tell his grandchildren wild stories about his time as a big man in Jamaica. Though I still had love for Peter Gay, I told myself her fate was her own fault. If she had never freed McDaniel, I would have never asked Mr. Paisley of my true origins. Now that I knew who I was, how could the child of a slave ever trust the mistress of a plantation? We were natural enemies. It was just that before I hadn't known. She had changed the course of my life in a way that was irrevocable, yet she was going off to England to forget this place. I could see how easy it was for them to slip. I knew I would change my mind, go with Mr. Paisley. I knew I could change my mind, go with Mr. Paisley, and continue to be white, but really I was becoming a true slave like my mother, for I had no choice in the matter. And how could I be with a man who had tortured my mother as he did? When the smoke began filling the room and all the guests ran to the doors, I was still at the table sipping wine and drinking my soup. I was not afraid. Fire is a painful way to die, but I thought most would be taken by the smoke first. I imagined all of the townspeople gathered around their ashes for the next morning, and I felt at peace. I did not want Peter Gay to feel any pain. I only wanted her to disappear from this earth. I thought Peter Gay would understand why I could not be on her side anymore. Instead, I had chosen the side of my mother. All our lives, we had both longed for our mothers. When she tried to follow me out the cellar door, I swung it closed and quickly held it shut with all my weight. She had always taken so much pleasure in tormenting me. I was pleased that it was my turn to see her squirm. I had tried so hard and for so long to be good in the way they taught me, and I had grown weary. Mr. McDaniel appeared. He pressed his weight against the door and then told me to run. I had assumed he barricaded it and vanished, but he must have remained and watched, saw that they had all escaped, and decided to put an end to Mr. Paisley with his own hands. I took no joy upon hearing of his death, yet I can't mourn. It is simply the most just outcome. Judge me however you will, it does not matter. My solicitor and Maddie, my only visitor, the poor dear, have asked me to write this, hoping these words might spare me the noose. There is not a lie that can save me, so I will tell you the truth. If I could do it again, I would have put poison in their food. I would have made sure that we succeeded. I caught a glimpse of Peter Gay before I ran. I looked over her shoulder and she gave me such a look of complete disbelief. I should have explained, but by then I knew I was pressed for time and I couldn't get out. I wanted to say to my friend, as I will end by saying to you now, that I have no wish to look upon a world that will not let you people sink down and stay down like the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Maisy. Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Just taking a minute to let it kind of sink in, hearing it again. I think particularly in today's climate, it's a lot to digest and hear.
Yeah, so we had some questions that Jara and Linda and I prepared, but just listening to it again, I want to start with a different question.
Okay.
And it's about the last excerpt that you read. And I would like to kind of hear your thoughts. And so before she finds out that her mom was enslaved, she has spent her childhood thinking that she's a white girl. And that reality gets totally blown up for her. And before that, in the absence of that knowledge, there's this friendship that she has. And what came to my mind was how the balance of equality that seemed to exist before she found this out in their friendship gets totally disrupted, right, by this knowledge of what her ancestry and bloodline really is. And so I'm curious, like, what do you think about the balance of equality and multiracial friendships and relationships, and how do you build that? How do you sustain that? How do you nurture it? How do you check it when it's out of balance? Like, what does that look like? And it is so real, you know, for this moment right now, when we have all of this going on and there are relationships that are rooted in real principles and values of equality and friendship and right, that agape love. And then we've got this whole other sort of facade of allies roaming around communities like ours, posing and actually causing harm. So that's kind of what I want to start.
I think in the context of this story, so for people who haven't read it, it is kind of set, it's structured as a series of confessions. One set of confessions is written by a girl who starts out thinking she's white and then realizes that she's Black, and she ends up, plotting kind of revenge against her best friend's father. And the other set of confessions is written by her best friend, who is white and who is the daughter of a plantation owner, and she ends up kind of betraying her. But I think, it depends on, what's more important to the character, the individual, or the collective. And so, at the beginning, she's very much thinking of herself and focused on not getting in trouble, and conforming. And I think towards the end, she realizes, when she hears, she's lived through the Christmas rebellion, and she's disconnected because she thinks it's, a bunch of Black slaves trying to kill white people. And she thinks of them as the enemy. And then later, when she realizes who she is, she realizes they've been fighting for her benefit. And so she kind of decides to, surprisingly, she decides to side with them, even though she's in a position where she could just pass and continue like reaping the privileges of, being white in that context at that time. And I think she realizes that there's no way to justify keeping her friendship the way it is and still, have solidarity with the slaves and her ancestors and her people. So, that's why she ends up, committing that kind of act of betrayal. She ends up being kind of just radicalized by the reality of who she is. But yeah, I think now, I don't know. I mean, I think now it's a very different time, I think. But I do think that now what I've noticed on social media is that there is like a kind of a more hard line. I think before, some people were able to kind of compartmentalize their friendships and, their family and, kind of write it off and say, I know this person is a little racist. I know this person is a little offensive, but they mean well. And I think people now are kind of thinking about the fact that history just keeps repeating itself over and over and over again. And, what we have to do to kind of stop this cycle. And part of that is to I think part of that people are realizing is to kind of take a hard line, and focus on solidarity with allies, but not kind of dismissing or normalizing the kind of racism as we've been kind of taught in the past. Does that answer your question, sort of?
Anyone else have any thoughts on that? Thoughts on the character in the book, or just thoughts on the question universally?
I think I'll take a minute to ask a follow-up question, Maisy. You spoke a little bit about, I forget the exact word that you used, but really just the surprise and all of the emotions that came along with her discovering who she actually was, and that being a Black woman, not a white woman. And I, as in listening to the book, the audio book, I was trying to figure out, okay, is this more tied? What was all of the emotion behind her decision to take that action? Was it more about what happened to her? Was it more about, or her family? Was it more about who she actually was? Was it more that everybody knew except for her? Can you tell us a little bit more about the decision to essentially kill them all?
I think it was also because for people who haven't read, it's also that she, not only does she find out that she's Black, but she also finds out that the person who raised her actually had was kind of grooming her. So I think the idea, what really radicalizes her is the knowledge that not only has she been lied to? And not only does she find out that her family, her real family, has kind of been brutalized, but it's also the knowledge that to continue pretending to be white, she has to kind of debase herself and be with this man that she had thought was like a father figure. So I think that's part of it too. And then she also, I guess she ultimately also starts to question the intentions of her best friend and whether she knew all along too. So I think that also radicalizes her. And then there's this other whole other character, you know, the Mr. McDaniel character, who's kind of like supposed to be like, you know, kind of like the serpent in her ear, kind of like, you know, convincing her to do it too. So there's that element of it too. Mm-hmm. But I think I was thinking too of like actual historical figures. I'm forgetting the person's name. It wasn't this rebellion. I think it was the Morant Bay rebellion in Jamaica. But there is another rebellion where, you know, one of the people who was hung was actually a slave owner's son, like who, you know, who, when I read about his life, it seemed like he lived his life trying to get this kind of approval from his father. And in the end, his father ended up being poor and losing all his money. And so he actually bought his father a home and bought his new wife a home and, you know, paid for them to go back to England. But I think the wife wouldn't even like speak to him because he was Black. You know, and I think he ended up helping the slaves who rebelled. And he denied like the extent of what he was accused of, but he ended up being hung as like a conspirator to the, you know, rebellion anyway. So there were, I think in a lot of slave novels, and especially novels that take place in the Caribbean, there's this idea that people who were biracial or light-skinned, who had this privilege, or house slaves, like never rebelled, and that wasn't like true at all. You know, so I was thinking of that too. It's just like anybody could be, you know, radicalized based on the circumstance. Like even though he wasn't raised to have this sense of identity and to relate to people who were slaves and oppressed, he did anyway, and he ended up siding with them and paying for that. So I kind of based that character on that figure too.
Thank you.
Hi, Maisy. This is Linda. I love the book. I thought it was really good. And I like that you had so many different characters, but they all were related somehow, some way. And so one of the things that stuck out to me was Abel's character. He made a decision very early on to leave the family and go try to get different opportunities. But his one decision to leave the family and then start a new life, essentially, kind of affected everyone else. And so for me, that was like a major theme, how one person in the family's decision can affect generations. And so I just wanted to know, like, if you had to choose another person who you felt was that impactful, or did you feel like because of the decision that he made, it impacted everyone else?
I don't think anybody else in the book had such like a broad, like sweeping effect as like Abel. You know, and I think it was because of like the position he was in the family, him being the patriarch, and also the time that he was living in. But I think, yeah, if I was going to pick somebody, I guess why I included the 18th century characters was I think that they, you know, they have the most sweeping effect on everybody. You know, the Mr. Fowler character, the McDaniel character, all the characters from the 18th century who are, you know, directly involved in like the system of colonialism. Like, I guess I wanted to show that Abel himself has this huge impact because, you know, of the time that he was living in, and because he was a man, he had this power over this family. And then also I wanted to show that, you know, colonialism still has like a day-to-day impact on the family, even though it's kind of invisible, even though they don't see it. You know, they're living out the effect of these secrets from the present day and from the past too.
Jennifer S has a question. I'm trying to unmute you, but you won't unmute. There you go. Wait, up. Is it unmuted? Hold on a second. No. Okay, there we go.
Oh, there she goes.
Go now.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now.
Okay. I'm sorry, I forgot the character's name, but the character, she was white, but she went to Jamaica with
Debbie.
Debbie?
Yeah.
Okay, yes, Debbie went to Jamaica and she threw the diary in the ocean. I mean, I didn't see that coming, but what was like the symbolism behind that? Were you trying to allude to the fact that some secrets should just stay, or we don't need to connect with our past? What?
I think I just wanted to show like the difference between the two kind of sides of the family. Like, I guess we'll talk about DNA tests later, but I was thinking, I think that story specifically was inspired by me taking a DNA test and seeing that, you know, when you go generations back, you know, they show your ancestors, and, you know, if you're from the Caribbean, and most probably if you're a Black person, you'll definitely have, from a colonized country, you'll definitely have ancestors who are, like I had 4th to 6th generation, were like half white, half Black. So I guess I wanted to show the different kind of like effects of colonialism. Like, part of the theme of the book is kind of how trauma is this kind of ghost, you know, that haunts people without them knowing, and how colonialism is this kind of ghost that haunts you without you knowing. And so, you know, for some of the Black characters in the book, they're kind of they're not aware of what it is, but they're kind of born with this kind of being haunted by this trauma. Whereas with Debbie, she's kind of innocent in the beginning. She doesn't know anything about her family's history during that time. She doesn't think she has anything to do with slavery until somebody physically hands her this book. And that book is kind of like handing her the trauma, and she has to like all of a sudden digest it. You know, and she tries to do the right thing, and she tries to accept it, you know, and process it, but because she wasn't prepared, because nobody ever spoke to her about it, she just can't handle it, and she just, you know, it's just kind of like weakness, or fear. She just doesn't want the trauma, and she just tears it up at the end. So that's kind of what I was thinking, whereas the other characters don't have this luxury of it being like their trauma being this physical thing that they can discard. You know, they just carry it inside of them. That's kind of what I was going for with that story.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yes. Thank you.
So I think it's interesting that you brought up the DNA testing, because as you know, I listen to the audiobook, but you can't help but to think like when you get your results, what your ancestors were like, where they came from, what their story was. And, you know, you're right, how one person's, you know, secret or 3 people's secrets can just turn into, you know, just parts of your history that completely get lost. And it, you know, it could be because of rape, and this one doesn't know who their father is, and there's rumors of this one's parent being a sailor or a merchant, or, you know, whatever the case may be. And you know, I can relate to that in my family. So thank you for writing that story. But yeah.
You know, I think an interesting juxtaposition to Debbie and the diary is, and so her experience with that, and then the experience of a lot of Black people in the diaspora, that even when we do find out our ancestry, we can't trace it back to a specific place, right? And so you can still get the DNA test, you can still find out where you're from, but getting back to that specific local place that you originally came from is not something that's, you know, likely going to happen for every single one of us that goes and does that ancestry test. And I didn't think about it before, but it's just a really nice contrast between, you know, maybe even sort of the European colonizing experience and coming to the America or wherever you ended up, and having a place that you can trace back to here, but then also trace back to in Europe in your original home. That's just really interesting.
Yeah, I think also I think one thing I was thinking about when I wrote that story too was the fact that, people will, like in my family, they'll kind of rewrite the story a little to be nicer. Like, I think like with one side of my family, I think they find ways to write themselves out of the narrative of slavery. Like they kind of, it's like on the one hand, they'll celebrate like having a white ancestor, but they'll tell this kind of tale. There's this whole mythology around making sure our white ancestors didn't have anything to do with slavery. The story keeps changing, and I'm like, it doesn't doesn't seem reasonable. But because my grandfather, he does sometimes say that he's like half white or his grandfather is white, and the story shifts a lot. But I think it's like, what do you do with those ancestors? Like, what do you do if your ancestor is this slave master and the slave? Like, how do we talk about that? What do we do with that? And I think with a lot of African Americans and a lot of people from the Caribbean, that is the case. You're kind of descendant from both, even though you weren't claimed by both, and you don't want to claim both. But that's kind of the reality of history.
I think Debbie alludes to that in when she starts beginning to find out her history, and it's her father that gave her the book,
the
right?
journal,
So when he's like, well, this is the way things were back then, they were away from their families and they took up with the Jamaican women. And she's like, no, you didn't take up with them. They were raped. They were slaves. So it's like, oh, it sounds better to say like they just had a relationship versus they were forced into this.
Yeah, and I think sometimes even like growing up with a Jamaican family, even though I feel like we're supposed to have this like deeper knowledge of history, like somehow I feel like I came away not knowing that. And even when I read a lot of novels that take place in Jamaica during that time, there's still this like love story. And I don't know why, even though the rest of the book is very violent, I noticed that all of the books, and I like them, but it's just, there's always somehow this master slave love story that keeps getting replicated. And I think it's almost like there's no way for them to explain the fact that, Black people and white people back then had children together without making it romantic. But when I was writing that story, I read, it's like one of the most complete diaries of a West Indian plantation owner by this guy named Thomas Thistlewood, and he kept a journal, I think, in Jamaica for over 20 years, and I think it's being housed at Yale. So there are a lot of books kind of dissecting it, and in it he like specifically keeps a log of every slave he raped, and it was like hundreds and many times, and so that was the reality. I feel like somehow we still end up trying to convince ourselves that it wasn't as bad as we think it was. But then when I read that, I was like, oh, it was worse, than I actually thought it was.
So to bring a little bit of levity, that's like a CSI or Criminal Minds, like, like when they go and they find who they're looking for, they have all these artifacts when you're like a serial killer or a serial killer. So,
he wrote it in like a weird like shorthand, like yeah. But then he also did have a slave who became his kind of common law wife and who he freed and had children with. But even that, but then he had slaves who ran away from him and didn't want to be with him, didn't want to be raped, and kept running away. So there was like a spectrum, but I don't think anybody on that spectrum was in love, and I think that that's something to think about.
I have a question. How much research did you do before, I guess, like writing? I don't know. It was so hard to, like, the way the book was written, to jump from like the present to the past. And how did you, like, how long did it take you to, I guess, do the research between, I guess, Jamaica, England, the colonization, and then America? how long did all that take?
Like 14 years. No, I mean, like, you know, I wrote it over the course of like, I guess like, I started in 2006. I finished like, say 2018. So yeah, like 12 years. But it wasn't consistent, you know, and I was working a lot during that time. So I had limited time to do everything. But I think sometimes I did procrastinate with research. So I spent a lot of time reading about Jamaican history. And then I read like a lot of like 100 years of the Jamaica Gleaner, which was probably unnecessary. But yeah, I did do a lot of research for it.
So was that diary in the book based off that diary that you were just referring to?
Yeah, it was very based off Thomas Thistlewood's diary.
And that story at the end, the little girls.
Yeah.
I had never heard that story, but I looked it up. That was I guess like not creepy, but like, wow. I
It
just
was creepy.
yeah. Yeah. I kept waiting for something else to happen. I didn't know where that was going, but
yeah, and that was based off yeah, for people who haven't read it, it's based off like Jamaican folklore. There's I haven't been able to hear the name out loud, but I'm assuming it's pronounced like Old Haig. Yeah, who's like so it's just this character in folklore, and like a lot of cultures have similar characters. She's like a Susian. She's kind of like almost like a vampire or a witch, and she's supposed to be like an old woman who lives in the community among people, and she looks normal, but at night she can take her skin off, and you know, she creeps into people's rooms, and she either, like in some versions, she'll take their life force or take their breath, and in other versions she'll suck their blood. And it was you know, it was a story that was told sometimes to like justify sudden death, especially in infants. It's kind of like the that Stephen King movie Sleepwalkers, if you've ever seen that. But
yeah.
so when you said that Vera they were trying to like, I guess, exercise her, or were you saying she had some kind of spirit, or just the people in the neighborhood didn't like her?
you know, I think I kind of wanted to leave it a little vague, but yeah, I think I was leaning more towards that her behavior was so unconventional for like a middle class or almost upper class woman that everybody just didn't know how to deal with her. So they assumed that there was something wrong with her. And also, like, it's a time when, if, you know, I did want to hint that she was struggling with like depression. It's a time when they didn't know what to do with mental illness. So if she did have like severe struggles, like some of the people would have leaned toward something supernatural rather than something psychological.
Her son was Vincent, right?
Yeah.
So it's interesting because when he was talking to the guy that used to be the priest that did the exorcism, and he's like, she struggled with depression, but there wasn't a word for that back then, you know. So it's like he recognized, like, no, there was nothing wrong with her. She wasn't possessed. You guys just didn't have a clear enough understanding of human nature. But I think that alludes to just even still today dealing with issues of mental health in our communities. I think we're doing a better job of it now, but for certain, you know, Caribbean cultures struggled with that.
Yeah.
For a while, probably still do, but yeah.
Yeah, I think still do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Black people in general, definitely, Jennifer, like they have a problem talking about like issues of mental health in the family. It's like we kind of brush that person to the side. We don't necessarily name what's bothering the person, as opposed to having it addressed. We kind of like, oh, that person's crazy. We say they're crazy, but there's really something going on there.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, hopefully now with us having social media, I think our generation and those coming in behind us are shedding light on things that maybe we just didn't have a way to do so before, but you just, the book has so many different elements to it. And they might be brief, you know, in some places, but, you know, it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, and I don't want to say it's like based on my family directly, but there's definitely a lot of, I think a lot of issues that I inferred that were never expressly mentioned in my family, but it's like, you know, it's like I just kind of took them for granted. All these stories about my ancestors or about my grandmother or my grandfather, kind of for granted and just accepted them. And then when I was older, I was like, oh, that's probably why they behaved that way. That's why they did what they did. You know, I can make more sense out of things now. So I think I put that kind of feeling of realization in the novel too. Oh, Leslie has a question.
Can you see it?
Yeah, so Leslie says, may I ask if how the story of this book changed you? One thing that I loved was that the Black people were truly family. Yeah, I think it just made me, I think I was just processing how like trauma works, I guess in a way that I didn't understand before starting this book. Like, I think, you know, there is like kind of the Vera character is like, I want to say like loosely to me representative of my grandmother, but you know, I didn't really know my grandmother. She was very sick when I was young. And then she died when I was in 5th grade. She was like bedridden for years. You know, so a lot of what I know about her, I learned through stories and, you know, through my mother's, specifically my mother's stories, because nobody ever really, I feel like nobody ever talks besides my mother. And she'll just like sometimes have a recollection and she'll just tell me some crazy story without any, you know, context. You know, and so I feel like once I got older, and to some extent I learned a lot about my father too, when they started to explain like things that happened in their childhood, I kind of understood their behaviors better. You know, I was like, oh, this is why, you know, like, you know, certain things like would set them off. This is why they would just fly off the handle when I did something. It was just, I feel like I could see the ghost of my grandparents through them. You know, so it's kind of about that. So I think it changed me in that it gave me like more empathy for my family and for my parents. And it also made me realize like how hard it is to hold a family together, especially a big family. And how like a lot of families like are kind of held together by like silence, you know, because if you were to say everything that happened, I think everybody has different versions of the past, you know, and it gets complicated when you challenge somebody's version of reality. You know, and that's what I see a lot played out between my mother, you know, and her siblings a lot. And I have seen over the years.
Did the book prompt you to get the DNA or do the DNA, like the ancestry, or did you do that before you started? Like, where in the process of doing the book did you decide, let me?
I think I did it, I definitely did it while I was working at the Newark Public Library. So I think I started working there in 2015, because I remember I talked to Dale, who's one of our colleagues who runs the James Brown room, and she was, you know, she was kind of like telling me like the pitfalls of doing it, you know, and I realized after I took it that's like, yeah, this is very serious, because you can see it allows you to opt in to see the people who are actually blood related to you who are on the site. And she had told me, she was like, you know, you could find out that, you know, somebody, you know, somebody that you thought was related to you isn't, or you could find like some other child that you didn't know people had. And like, it's very intense actually. You know, so I think I'd already started writing the novel long before that, but that definitely like influenced the novel a lot once I did it. Cause yeah, once I did do it, like people have been, it just like last week somebody said like, I don't know who my father is, but we're like third cousins, like, you know, can you help me? You know, and it's just like a big responsibility, and I don't know how to help. I don't know.
Maisy, I heard you share something that struck me. My family's from Mississippi. I actually traced my roots recently, so I know the parts of West Africa as well. But specifically, I'm thinking about my grandmother, who, and my family in general too, because there are a lot of secrets that it took me to become a 40-year-old woman before I ever found out. And one of them is that my mother, we didn't know that my grandmother was pregnant when they got married until my mother's 50th birthday. And that's because we had celebrated their 50th anniversary in December or whatever it was, a few months prior, and then my mother's 50th birthday. And I'm like, wait a minute, hold on. And the whole family. And so I'm curious to know, and this is kind of like trying to explore a little bit more about like Jamaican heritage and history compared to the history here in the States. What do you think that's based in? Is it shame? Is it like elitism or trying to establish status? What do you think those secrets and the I won't call them euphemisms, but I guess trying to make things prettier than they are. Where do you think that's rooted in?
Yeah, no, I think shame probably has a lot to do with it. I think both shame and status too. Yeah, like I remember when I went to Jamaica for my grandmother's funeral, on my father's side, and you know, during her, when we were preparing for her ceremony, for her funeral, my dad and uncle were talking about like changing dates to hide the fact that I guess they weren't married when they had their first child. But I was like, you know, they're still, you know, they were married now. What difference does it make? They had like 10 children together. But for some reason, it was a shameful secret, you know. But I feel like there was like worse things that my grandfather's done. I was surprised that was like a big deal. But yeah, I just find that happens constantly in my family. Or in all families. It's just, yeah, everybody just like kind of wants to make the truth prettier. But and then sometimes I think it's that people legitimately don't know. Because when I did take the DNA test, I was also looking at a lot of birth certificates. There's this website online that's free. It's run by the Church of Latter-day Saints called FamilySearch.org. And they do have a lot of Caribbean birth certificates. And so I found a lot of, it's hard to find from my mother's side, but my father's side, they live in this very small town and they've lived there since slavery, literally. So I found like a lot of their certificates there, you know, and what I found was that, you know, my father would say like, oh, your grandparents were married, or so-and-so is married to this person. I was like, no, it's not, they weren't married, it's the record. And people would argue with me. But I guess it's just, that's what they were told. And they just passed down this kind of lie, you know, over and over again. And so they really believed it was true. They weren't meaning to not tell the truth. That's what they sincerely believed.
Yeah.
Then there's like Abel's lie that you just can't make prettier, right? And so his daughter shows up at the door and there's nothing that he could ever possibly say to her that could make the fact that he decided to leave her when she was a little girl, like, pretty.
Yeah.
At least her, you know, he might think he's cleaned it up or made it sweeter, but, you know, all she can take in is you left.
Yeah.
And you just left us, period. So we've got the lies that kind of are the lies you can clean up. There are lies that I think, you know, sometimes might be in the best interest. It's best possible. And then there's lies that just are the lies that change people's lives forever in ways that, you know, you can't really imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, you know, one of the themes that I wanted to think about that I thought about when I was writing the book was like the theme of atonement, you know, and just like confessing. I think Abel thinks just confessing the truth is kind of an atonement, but it's not really, like, it can't really make up for the kind of devastating effect that it had on Irene's life and everybody else's life. You know, and really his act of confession is really kind of to unburden himself and to make himself feel like clean, you know, as he prepares for death. It's not really to help her or to, you know, help her heal. And I think even though he's a character that I have like a lot of empathy for, I feel like he is a composite of a lot of men in my life who don't understand that women are people and that have feelings, you know what I mean? And don't like, you know, kind of just think about men's feelings as the most important consideration, and don't really think about, you know, the devastating effect they have on women sometimes.
Kimberly asks, as a writer of Black stories, how were you able to move past or separate the need to tell a story versus the need to create a solution to the experiences that are presented in the story?
I think I just couldn't create a solution because I don't know what the solution is. I mean, I guess the solution to me is just like, for me, was just having all the characters face the truth. But I didn't necessarily show what they would do later in their lives with that truth. But yeah, I think, you know, as a writer, I just try to focus more on character. You know, and I think if you create a character that feels real to you, you know, they won't necessarily behave in a way that seems rational to you. They'll behave in a way that feels consistent to their character. You know, so that's kind of how I kind of avoided just having like clean solutions. It just seemed like wouldn't be realistic to these characters for them to just like have this epiphany and go on to like, you know, live a perfect life afterwards. It's just not how life works.
Do you have a favorite character in the book?
It changes. I like Irene. You know, she's like a character who's kind of based on my mother, I think.
Okay. Any other questions out there? Thoughts?
Oh, there's another question in the chat from Jen Scott. I've always wondered if being from more collectivist societies has more of an effect on how truthful folks are, especially when you mix in the morality associated with people who consider themselves religious. You know, I think, I don't know, I guess I would think the opposite sometimes. Well, I think, yeah, I guess when I think about my father's side of the family, my mother's side of the family, the difference is that my father does come from, they did live in a very small community, a very small rural community where, you know, there was, like, when I went back, there's something, but really, like, when my father grew up, there was, like, nothing. And I think, you know, one of the things I learned when I went to my grandmother's funeral is just, like, how much that they depended on their neighbors, how much they depended on their church for survival. You know, I think, which sometimes explains why maybe they would clean up the truth to kind of like look better for their community, because everybody knows them, and everybody knows like their business, and you know, they want to keep face, I guess.
Yeah, because I feel like perception matters more in those instances, right? But the funny thing is you hide stuff and everybody else knows what the truth is anyway, even if you don't want to say it.
That's the weird thing about Jamaican culture that surprises me. And I mean, it's like, I always feel like I'm going to get in trouble for stereotyping, but I just feel like the way I grew up, or the people that I knew, like my uncles and various things, you know, a lot of them had children out of wedlock. A lot of, you know, when I was doing my family tree, I was like, you know, I found out like my great grandmother was kind of like the other woman. Like my great grandfather was married, he was married and had a whole other family. You know, and I feel like I encountered that a lot when I was growing up, and it was so normal to me, but so that I didn't even know that people were ashamed of it. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized like people are like extremely ashamed of it. Yeah, you know, so just because something is kind of, something takes place a lot in a society doesn't mean it's necessarily like normalized. For some reason, it's still like, there's still like shame ascribed to it. And I think part of that too is that I feel like that's part of the contradiction with that culture, is that, you know, it is a colonized society. So no matter who people were or where they are on the spectrum of race, you're always aspiring to be to those colonial ideals, those British colonial ideals, like no matter who you are. So I felt like, yeah, they still wanted to be that kind of picture perfect, you know, Christian family. And even though they didn't behave, even if they didn't behave that way, they still, like, you know, they hit it to seem more like they were. Does that answer your question, Jen? Or I'm rambling?
Oh, wait, I think we have another question. Apart from wanting to be a kind of truth teller, do you suppose that the writer is often all the characters in a novel? I'd also be interested in the opinion of the others here.
Yeah, I don't know if other people have opinions on this. I think so. I think, yeah, in a way, to write about somebody, you have to, even if you don't start identifying them at the beginning, with them at the beginning, you kind of write until you do, for me. So yeah, I kind of see myself in everybody a little bit, even if it's like a character like Abel who does terrible things. What do other people think?
I didn't necessarily see myself in the characters, but I feel like the stories that were like uncovered in the novel were stories that families go through, and different things that families go through, regardless of whether or not you were in Jamaica or in Africa or in Newark. These are things that people deal with, and I like that you approached it in the novel.
Yeah, I feel like there are very few. I mean, I think Abel's secret is extreme in that he faked his own death, but I think that there are a lot of people who go through that experience of finding out about, you know, that kind of secret. Like there's some family member you didn't know about, or yeah, there's just some relationship you never knew about. It's pretty, you know, that kind of betrayal is pretty frequent, I think, in most families, no matter where you come from.
I think that
No,
Abel,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, I cut someone off.
No, go ahead.
Oh no, I was saying, I think, I'm not sure that I see myself in all the characters, but I could see how you as a writer, you have to identify with all of them in order to make their stories like authentic. When I started, like from the first chapter that you read, you know, I didn't really want to like Abel because I said, oh, he just left. You know, but again, like you said, I mean, I have a part of my family that is Jamaican, and then my father is from the South. So it's kind of the same realities. Like there were outside children, there were people who were pregnant before marriages, and you know, my Nana said to me, like, you know, we didn't ask those questions. If somebody said that that was your aunt, that was your aunt. We don't know about blood or, you know, any of those things. So as the story went on, I didn't judge Abel, I guess, as much just for his first like truth, what, you know, what he said. But I think that because there was like shame in divorce, Abel couldn't just walk away. And not that he was justified in what he did, but I don't know, I think he just couldn't live up to the pressure of Vera. It was too much.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to convey. Not like Vera herself is at fault necessarily, but just you know, like I feel like back then a lot of people came together who wouldn't have come together otherwise, just because there was no, they you know, they were just like that kind of conformity was pushed on people. You know, and I think for some people, especially like women, you know, sometimes the only way to escape your house is to just like be with a man so you could leave. And I feel like I saw a lot of people in my family who had that situation, like who, I think my parents were in that situation, who were just together because they just wanted to get away from their families, and they just weren't right for each other. But, you know, you're taught that this is what you're supposed to do. So you kind of just go along with it.
Maisy and Jerry, you guys had talked about doing the DNA test, and I'm just curious for everyone that's here today, like, have you guys done it? Would you consider doing it? I know, Maisy, you mentioned that it's really heavy, right? And then it could be negative effects of it. Like, Jerry, did you feel that way?
Uh, I didn't feel it wasn't negative to me. It was empowering to me because like I have a daughter who's in kindergarten, and one of the projects is they'll ask what country are you from? And I'm like, how can you ask that question when 90% of the kids in the class don't know? You know what I mean? And so for me, it was empowering, particularly because I did the African ancestry DNA test, and that's the one that takes you all the way back to the very specific. It tells you more than what history can tell you. So it takes me all the way back to which specific nation in Africa, which tribe, etc. So I've got my Fulani earrings on here. And so to me, it was empowering just because I made a lot of assumptions that were inaccurate. And I feel like in 2020, we shouldn't have to assume those things. And so I was surprised because my twin sister, obviously ours is the same, but my brother-in-law did it as well and found out that his whole paternal side is Portuguese. So essentially the colonizer. And we're like, wait a minute, because, her children's hair, is curly and their complexion is on the fairer side. And people would always say, are you mixed? And she'd say, or what do you mix with? And she'd always say black and black, just essentially out of pride, but also ignorance because we didn't know, and so now that to her was a little bit of an unpleasant surprise, but history tells us, so to me, I loved it. And I've been researching a lot. And someone asked the question, I think it was Jennifer S., about Maisy, on one hand, kind of uncovering all of these uncomfortable truths and then grappling with what to do about it now. That's kind of how I feel like having done the DNA test, because I look at the life that I live, and I look at the nations, that I come from, Guinea-Bissau being one of them, and like researching it further. I went taking down, I have art that we got when we were in Paris, and I went and took it down, even though it's original art there, because I'm like, when I look into the history of it, it just upset me, and I didn't want it here. But I truly think there's power in it. What about anybody else? Does anybody else have any experience with it?
I thought what was interesting, I thought it was empowering too, some aspect of it, because I think, when I feel like a lot of Jamaican people, you're told that you come from specific cultures, and then it was totally different. Like I was always told, or when I read history books, they're like, oh, Jamaican people come from the Ashanti people of Ghana. And so that's what I kind of expected. But they don't give you the tribes when you do it on Ancestry.com. They do give you like the breakdown, and it's like, oh no, mostly, I'm Nigerian. So that was like unexpected, and that's interesting. But yeah, I think I agree. It just like opens the door for more questions, and it's kind of frustrating because you can't you can't keep going back. There's only so far like research will take you, I guess.
I have a question for both of you. I was thinking about doing the DNA thing, but you said that you can, I guess, click something that people can reach out to you. Isn't it a little bit frustrating, because even if you realize you're related to somebody, there's only so much research or so much documentation that we have. We can, I guess the DNA test can prove you have the same blood, but you could never figure out how you're actually related. Is that correct?
I think it depends on how far, because it's like cousins, somebody's your second cousin, your third cousin. I think second cousin level, it's possible to do the research, but it depends, because there's one woman who contacted me, and it was like, actually she contacted me, and then her search angel, there are people you can hire if you don't know who your birth parents are, who will like do the research for you. And I guess, so she said like her father was some Jamaican man in Brooklyn in the 90s. And, I just didn't, and then she told me the first name, and I just, I asked my parents, I asked my family, and I had no idea how we're related. But somehow that person did find the guy and found out the last name. I don't have any idea how we're connected, but, somehow it's my second cousin, I guess. But, I guess I'm going to talk to her more to figure out how she made that connection, but it's possible. I think if it's, and somebody recently that contacted me who's older, who's like my grandfather's age, I did find out that she was related to my grandmother. You know, so I think if it's only a couple of generations, you can trace it back if you communicate with your family to some extent. I think, but I guess the drawbacks are, yeah, that, and then, you know, the whole idea of like the, you know, your information being out there and kind of owned by a company. What will they do with that information in the future? That's the only, I guess, buyer beware thing to think about.
There are some differences because African ancestry doesn't keep your DNA, but because of that, there's limitations to the information that they can provide. So it depends on what you're looking to discover. For me, I shouldn't say it sounds bad, but ideally this book club will become even more of an environment where we can be very, very open. But for me, I wasn't particularly interested in finding other family. Like, I'm good with the family that I have, but I was very curious to know who I am, you know, not just from Mississippi, because obviously I'm not from Biloxi, Mississippi, you know. But yeah, African ancestry doesn't keep the DNA or sell it.
Oh, that's good.
So does it match you with people or no?
Ancestry.com does, but you have to opt in. They don't automatically do it. So you can opt out of that if you don't want to.
Okay.
I've been matched on Ancestry just through a family tree.
Oh, okay.
Which is really interesting. I haven't done, my sister did DNA. I haven't done it.
Yeah, I think the family tree aspect is cool because then there are people who have kind of done the work for you. You know, and if they have complete trees and there's like an overlap, you can match up and you'll get a lot more information.
I use familysearch.org, and there was an ancestor that had the same name, and then they were saying she came from Canada, and it like connected me to somebody else's tree, but that can't be my same ancestor because I like found that same person on the census like in Virginia. I don't know, so it was like a little confusing. So I don't know if it's like the search angels or whoever, like the volunteers putting stuff in and they make those links. But I guess it would be a little bit clearer with the DNA because
I think it's the computer. I'm in the local history room at the library. The computer just makes the link so it can make mistakes, unfortunately.
oh, okay.
So we have some messages up in the chat. Beth said, there's a lot of research you can do if you want to actually go to the towns and things like that, at least second and third cousins, like Maisy says, but some can't be done online. Ancestry.com also automatically matches your family tree if there's the same person in both. And then Leslie says the Newark Public Library also has a web guide for genealogy with lots of extra sources for African Americans.
I mean, family. Sorry, just one thing I discovered too when I was looking is that it's hard. One thing that makes it harder is that some of the records, at least in Jamaican records, were handwritten, so there are just a lot of errors with last names. You know, and I was able to find them, but a lot of ancestors had the last name spelled wrong, the first name spelled wrong. So you have to look, search for a lot of different variations of your name to find people sometimes. Sorry.
Oh no, I had a question for Leslie about, it says the Newark Public Library has a web guide.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, we can put the link. This is Beth, not Leslie, but I'll put the link.
Do you have that for like
There are two databases. One is Ancestry, another is Heritage Quest. But on the online resources page of the library website, you can move down in a yellow box, thanks to Beth. She put it in yellow. There are a few other little pointers, and one is if you want more librarians like us, we have, you know, based on the questions people ask us, we go scouting for other resources. And I know I've also turned to people like Dale Colston from JBAR because I know she loves to do genealogical research. So she gave me a few additions.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, Ancestry.com has been free during the pandemic, right? Is it still free, Leslie?
It is for a little while longer. They have, I'm not asking them when it's going to end because maybe then they'll decide when it's going to end. But originally they said just during the COVID crisis. So it could be for anybody interested. I'll get it. Well, you can do it now, go play with it. And if stuff doesn't make sense to you, in contact, we're working from home. We'll work with you on that. But I'm guessing that maybe July might be the end of that. And I don't know what our budget is like. But the Heritage Quest, I like it less than Ancestry. I think it's a little spotty, but it's useful too. But I really do like some of those web sites too.
Let me just clarify, the remote access is what's free right now, so you can get that. I linked it in the chat from your home, but we always have Ancestry.com at the library, so hopefully once we reopen, you'll still be able to come to the library and use it.
Yeah, you can come and we can see your beautiful faces. Yes. Forget, don't bother right now. Just wait.
Well, thank you so much, Maisy. Thank you for coming in on the book club today. I know everyone enjoyed the book.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for reading.
Maisy, yeah, it was definitely enjoyable. I'm not a huge novel reader, but I become one after reading. Yeah, These Ghosts Are Family. So thank you so much for I think igniting that light. I do want to call out a few things before we wrap up. One is just thanking you sincerely. We're happy to have this time with you. And for those of you who haven't gotten the book, make sure that you do. It's not too late. It still will totally be worthwhile to spend the time with it. And maybe even read it again if you already had it. We will be doing this. This was our first, so we're so excited that you all were a part of this inaugural book club. It's not just during quarantine, but just an opportunity to enjoy more of what the Newark Public Library has to offer, or get more in touch with our own creative sides. And as women, as people, be good to ourselves, be good to the creative and curious side of ourselves. And we're going to be doing this every first Tuesday. We've got the next 2 books already lined up. One of them is going to be called Push Out. You might be familiar with it. Lauren is holding it up now. It's about the criminalization of Black girls in schools. Obviously, very relevant topic of conversation right now. Whether you're moms or not, it's relevant to everybody. Those who are educators, please share the word, spread the word, because it's an opportunity for us to have some conversation that will hopefully help some people and continue to empower each and every one of us. The other I'm excited about, it's called Love from the Vortex. That one's a collection of poems, but it really gets into, I would say, some of the spiritual side, but also it's not religious, but also learnings from different experiences. And we're going to have some gentlemen on that call as well to share kind of some thoughts and feedback on that. That one will be in August. So the Push Out will be in July, and Love from the Vortex will be in August.
And we will have the author of Love for the Vortex for the August. And we will likely do a viewing. There's a documentary that goes with Push Out, and the library has purchased a license. We're just waiting for the DVD to come. So the book club will be followed up by a viewing party.
Yep, I'm putting in the titles right now. Okay, and as we're doing that, though, we ask that you continue to be engaged and, like we said, spread the word. Here's the first.
Yeah, and let me just, we're going to try to get copies of Love from the Vortex to Source of Knowledge, so that we can support the author, but also support a local business as well. So we have all of your email addresses, and we'll kind of keep you up to date since that's in August and it's poems, and you can be a little bit more flexible reading it, so that we can all resist, including myself, going to Amazon and getting it, so that we can make sure that our folks down there on Broad Street, get some business and get the support they need during this time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lauren. All right, I'm gonna go eat some Jamaicans. This was waiting for me. Have a great one, everybody.
Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you, Maisy.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.